Hey, welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I'm your host, Eli Ayala, and today we're going to be covering the transcendental argument for God's existence. So this is going to be a really fun episode. I'm looking forward to getting a little deeper into the argument, kind of walking through some of its main points. Now, it's super exciting. There are a couple of things that I want to kind of, before we jump into our topic, to bring people's attention to. I just received this book here. I don't know if you could see this here on the camera there. I don't know if it's blurring out or whatever, but this is a book called The Future of Reformed Apologetics, Collected Essays on Applying Van Til's Apologetic Method to a New Generation. Its contributors include K. Scott Oliphant, Daniel Strange, Christopher Watkin, James Anderson, Vern Poitras, W. Rob Edwards, Brian Matson, Nathan Shannon, and David O. Filson. And so I just finished reading the foreword. And I'm going to be jumping into the introduction and then chapter 1 soon, hopefully. And this was sent to me. This is a free copy sent to me by Westminster Seminary Press. And they asked me to do a review. And so my goal is to read through the book. And I'm kind of debating in my mind, should I review the book after I've read the entire thing, or should I review sections of it as I finish it? So, review the introduction, review chapter 1, and kind of, so I'm not sure. I'm still debating. But this is super cool that I was able to receive this. Looking forward to jumping into this book. I also was invited to write the foreword of an upcoming book on analysis of the debate between Dr. Greg Bahnsen and Gordon Stein. So I'm still waiting for some details in terms of what that will entail, but super excited. So got a lot of good things in store in the future. And I've been hopping onto some other folks' channels for interviews and things like that. So that's been greatly enjoyable. And I have a speaking engagement coming up in the spring, I think, out in Iowa, where I will be giving a series of talks to equip evangelists to go out there and engage with folks and engage in apologetic kinds of discussions. So super excited for that. And if you guys know a previous video, again, I'm not sure when these videos, the order of them come out, but I did make mention of the possibility of sharing the platform with Dr. James White and Dr. Jason Lyle in an event outside Nashville somewhere down the line. I don't know. There's no date specifically set for that, and the background stuff is being worked out for that. But we'll see. I will keep folks updated when more information comes out on those things. Okay. So once again, this is Revealed Apologetics. If you have not yet subscribed, please click the subscribe button, the notification bell to get all future videos. And if you have a question or you want me to address a specific topic, you can totally send in your question at revealedapologetics@gmail.com. I do read my emails. And if you have a question that is interesting to me or something that would be fascinating to explore, then I am more than happy to address it in the form of a video when I catch the time. So thank you so much for tuning in, guys. Now, what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about TAG, the transcendental argument for the existence of God. Now, transcendental arguments come in a variety of flavors and a variety of forms. I'm going to be addressing the specific version of TAG that I like to use, and then I'm going to be walking through the argument point by point. Okay, and so hopefully this is going to be useful for folks. So what is a transcendental argument historically? Well, transcendental arguments historically have been anti-skeptical arguments. They're meant to address the skeptic, someone who is doubting some proposition, and a transcendental argument, when successfully done, tries to show that some proposition is true by the impossibility of the contrary. And so it is a form of indirect argumentation in terms of which you show that something is true, that in the sense that even in denying it, you have to presuppose it, right? So transcendental arguments seek to prove things by the impossibility of the contrary. So when I say something is true by the impossibility of the contrary, what I really mean by that is that's just a summary, roundabout way of saying that it is demonstrated by transcendental necessity or anything along those lines. All right. So let's jump right into the argument then. So how do I typically formulate my argument? It's pretty simple. It's got two premises and a conclusion. The argument is valid. The conclusion does in fact follow if the premises are true. And the first premise of my argument is defended transcendentally. All right. So premise 1, if knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true. Premise 2, knowledge is possible. Conclusion, therefore, the Christian worldview is true. Now, The transcendental argument for the truth of the Christian worldview, as formulated here, what I've just provided there, really is going to hinge on the necessity of Christianity as the precondition for the very possibility of knowledge. So the first premise, if knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true, is going to require most of the careful defense. That is what I like to say, it's the premise that's going to carry most of the weight, okay? And so this is going to require the more careful analysis. Now, it's asserting not merely the truth of Christianity, but if you think about it, it's transcendental necessity for rationality itself, for knowledge and intelligibility. We can kind of fill it in with whatever we'd like there. To establish this, we're going to have to show that the Christian worldview provides what we call the ontological and epistemological conditions necessary for knowledge, while all competing worldviews ultimately collapse into skepticism, inconsistency, arbitrariness, or anything along those lines. And so what does that look like? Okay, so someone might ask, what is the justification for the truth of premise one? Dr. Greg Bahnsen was a renowned Christian apologist, philosopher, and seminary professor, and his life's work is now at your fingertips with Bahnsen U. Bahnsen U aims to bring seminary-level education to every Christian anytime, anywhere, absolutely free. Gain access to over 140 courses covering theology, apologetics, eschatology, and law, featuring sermons, seminary lectures, and more from the legendary Dr. Greg Bahnsen. Now, if you sign up today at apologiastudios.com and join over 13,000 users already benefiting from this incredible resource, you will not regret it. And soon, they're expanding with Bahnsen U Plus and Bahnsen U Live, bringing fresh supplemental learning and real-time engagement. Again, go to apologiastudios.com and start your journey today. Well, first, or someone says, what's the inference for this argument? What principle of inference is being used in this argument? Well, if you understand logic and you understand the nature of the argument I laid out, it is obviously following a basic modus ponens format. Modus ponens would be something along the lines of if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. If knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true. Knowledge is possible, therefore the Christian worldview is true. Now, the first premise is saying that if knowledge is even possible, the Christian worldview is true. And so in essence, I'm saying that the ontological status of the Christian worldview, its metaphysical picture, its picture of reality, and its picture of knowledge, epistemologically speaking, must be the case in order for the possibility of knowledge to be the case. And so what that's saying is that the Christian worldview provides the preconditions, or I would say the necessary preconditions for the very possibility of knowledge. Now, it's important at this point to lay out, what are those preconditions? What makes knowledge possible? What are the preconditions for knowledge? Knowledge properly understood, if you think about it, presupposes objective truth, the reliability of human cognitive faculties, the existence of universal and invariant logical laws. It presupposes an epistemic connection between mind and reality. Okay, Christianity, I would argue, uniquely accounts for these features in a way that non-Christian worldviews cannot. Now, there are more things that is required for now. You need enduring personal identity through time. I think I said the laws of logic. There's rationality, reliable human cognitive faculties. You need to bring together unity and diversity. So the whole issue of the problem of the one and the many, which has been a discussion throughout the history of Western philosophy, especially in the writings of the pre-Socratics. And a whole host of other things must be the case for knowledge to be possible. And so this argument is trying to show that given the truth of the Christian worldview, the actual truth of the Christian worldview, the ontological truth of the Christian picture of reality, and the epistemological considerations as to how knowledge is gained within the Christian system must be the case in order for knowledge to be possible. Now, why should we think that this is true, right? Well, if you think about it, if we lay out the Christian picture, we see that given the Christian picture, those preconditions are satisfied, okay? For example, Christianity uniquely accounts for these features in, as I said, in a way that non-Christian perspectives can't. If you think about it, the Christian doctrine of God as the absolute, personal, rational, and sovereign creator ensures that reality is inherently intelligible, right? Since God is the God of truth, John 14:6 says this, and all throughout Scripture, God is the ground of truth. When you think in terms of metaphysically what God is, that makes perfect sense, right? His creation is ordered according to his rational nature, and not just his rational nature, mind you, his consistent nature, right? And so creation itself is ordered according to his rational and consistent nature, guaranteeing a correspondence between human cognition and external reality. And this is so important because without a metaphysical ground for truth, knowledge would be reduced to mere subjective opinion or a social construct or something along those lines, making objective knowledge pretty much illusory. Okay? Now, the Christian worldview, I would also argue, uniquely accounts for the preconditions of intelligibility by grounding something like logic in the immutable, that's a key point here, the immutable, the unchanging, consistent nature of God himself. Logical absolutes, such as the law of non-contradiction, are not material entities, okay? Nor are they human conventions, right? If they were contingent, they could fail to apply, undermining all reasoning. But as necessary reflections of God's perfect rationality and his consistency, we argue that they are universal, invariant, okay, providing a fixed foundation for all of knowledge. Now, you contrast this with something like an atheistic materialism, which I think is going to struggle to justify the existence of immaterial logical principles in a purely physical universe. And if you hold to something like a relativistic worldview, right, you're going to render something like logic a cultural artifact, pretty much leading to something we might think as epistemic nihilism or something along those lines. Now, I am fully aware of various accounts of logic and its attempted universality or lack thereof. I mean, I hear all the time that logic is not universal, okay, which I think is problematic. I'm very familiar with the idea that the laws of logic are linguistic constructs that are used to describe the consistency of reality. We will address all of those points in just a bit, okay? But just as a surface level kind of analysis here, I think that those non-Christian worldviews are going to have a problem here. Now, again, the Christian doctrine of the Imago Dei, right? This idea that humans are created in the image of God, okay, within the Christian worldview, justifies the reliability of human cognition. If you think about it, in the Christian worldview, because our minds reflect the rationality of our Creator, we can trust our rational faculties to provide true beliefs about the world. All right, this is in stark contrast to something like, naturalistic evolutionary accounts of cognition, which reduce thought processes to survival-driven chemical reactions, which really provide no warrant for trusting our reasoning as what we might call truth tracking. Okay, as Alvin Plantinga has argued in various places, is if naturalism and evolution were true, okay, we would have a defeater for believing in the reliability of our cognitive faculties and thereby undercutting the very possibility of knowledge. Now, other worldviews similarly fail, I think, to provide those necessary preconditions for knowledge for a wide variety of reasons. Take something like polytheism, okay? Polytheism, by putting forth the idea of multiple independent deities, lacks a coherent metaphysical unity that can ground something like universal truths. And so pantheism, for example, has a problem as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about polytheism, but just walking through this quickly, something like pantheism, again, is going to dissolve, the distinction between the mind and reality, which collapses into kind of an irrational monism, right? We can talk about that as well, where pretty much on all distinctions that one could make, including the distinction, by the way, between truth and falsehood, are going to be illusory, and that's going to be a problem epistemologically. Skepticism, of course, regardless of what flavor, I mean, it's going to depend what flavor of skepticism you hold to, but depending on what you hold to, if you're going to deny, as a skeptic, the very possibility of knowledge outright, that's going to be logically problematic as well. And so in each case, I would argue that Christianity alone emerges as the necessary foundation for knowledge. Now, once this first premise is established, okay, the remainder of the argument is going to follow deductively, at least how I've laid it out here. Since premise 2, knowledge is possible, is self-evident in this sense. I don't mean self-evident in like a neutral sense, that it's independent of a worldview, but it is evident in the sense that even the skeptic needs to assume knowledge in order to argue against the possibility of knowledge if he wants to deny this particular premise. Now, the Christian worldview, I would argue, is true. It's inescapable. The attempt to deny the Christian worldview, presupposes its truth. For any meaningful argument against Christianity is going to rely on the very categories that I've argued that Christianity alone provides. And so the impossibility of the contrary confirms that the Christian worldview is not merely one rational option among many, but the necessary precondition for all thought. So let's run through this real quick. If knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true. Knowledge is possible, therefore the Christian worldview is true. First premise is the transcendental premise, okay? What we're saying positively, that the Christian worldview provides the foundation and grounding for and a justification for the necessary preconditions for the possibility of knowledge itself. Knowledge presupposes truth, God as the ground of all truth, and as a personal being reveals truth. So we have a grounding for truth. We have an epistemological link between the one who can reveal truth and finite creatures created in God's image and created for the purpose of apprehending that truth. We can justify that link as well. Okay. Knowledge presupposes logic. Logic is grounded in the consistent nature of God. So within the Christian worldview, logic fits nicely within the Christian worldview as and even if you want to say that they are linguistic constructs meant to describe the consistency of reality, even if you want to go that route, sure. The laws of logic are linguistic descriptions that describe the consistent nature of God. We're going to get into that in a little bit more detail later, okay? Unity and diversity, the triune God, the picture of God that is presented in Scripture provides a basis for unifying universals and particulars, right? Which is a very important discussion throughout the history of philosophy. And unity and plurality are actually necessary preconditions. Bringing those together are necessary preconditions for the possibility of knowledge itself. That is grounded in the triune God. Enduring personal identity through time. This is grounded given the idea of creation and being created in the image of God and so forth. And so the Christian worldview, you can go through the list of what must be true for the possibility of knowledge to obtain. The Christian worldview has the sufficient ingredients to ground and justify those things in a way that does not result in arbitrariness or inconsistency. Now, of course, the claim that it doesn't provide that is going to be a feature of the Christian surviving, so to speak, the attempted internal critique of the opponent. Okay, and so I grant that that's something that will, obviously there's more that has to be done here. Okay, so for example, responding to everything I just said is going to require the unbeliever to posit a worldview that can ground these things, hence falsifying the transcendental premise. However, it's not simply presenting an alternative. You actually now have to survive the internal critique of that alternative, showing that the alternative grounds these foundations in a non-arbitrary, non-inconsistent fashion. So there's a lot more work that has to be done here. Now, there are many attempts to superficially interact with the argument that I've presented here. And I sometimes scour through some of the comments and things like that, and I found a fun one that I'd like to interact with. But we'll get into we'll get into a wide variety of topics here. But real quick, I am talking quickly, and I want to take a quick sip of my coffee, so give me 1 second. Introducing All Access, your premium gateway to deeper apologetic and theological insights. Through Q&A sessions, theological lectures, and exclusive bonus content, All Access takes your learning to the next level. Support the ministry of Apologia Studios while unlocking incredible resources like Ask Me Anything, which is an interactive live stream featuring Jeff Durbin. We have the Academy featuring theological lectures from leading experts and exclusive content from shows like Apologia Radio and Cultish. With more exciting content on the way, there's never been a better time to join. Visit apologiastudios.com and click join to get started today. Oh, I hate when that happens. So yeah, I had my coffee. It was super hot, and I've been blabbing for a while, and now it's warm. It's lukewarm. Ugh. So whatever. I don't have time to heat it up right now, so we're just going to have to run with this. But so in reading some of the comments to my presentation of my argumentation in various contexts, someone suggested that why can't Odin and Thor be the precondition for intelligibility? And of course, there is a surface level understanding of the nature of transcendental arguments when someone presents this, but at the same time, it is an attempt, I think, and I understand this attempt, it is an attempt to show that the idea that the triune God, right, the Christian worldview, and the triune God grounds knowledge and intelligibility is arbitrary. And so that you can replace, Yahweh, for example, for any old deity that you like. And so this person's suggesting, well, how do you know Odin or Thor, doesn't provide these? Okay. So now this is very important. So this isn't like a difficulty. This isn't something like, oh my goodness, I never thought about that. What if someone said, Odin and Thor can provide the preconditions for intelligibility? Okay. By the way, you're able to do that in terms of presenting the argument, right? If knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true. Knowledge is possible, therefore the Christian worldview is true. You can replace the Christian worldview with anything you want. right? If knowledge is possible, Odin and Thor exist. Knowledge is possible, therefore Odin and Thor exist. You can do that, okay? You can plug anything you want into the argument. The question is, will the thing you plug in actually be able to ground and provide those preconditions that the argument is trying to establish, okay? And so that's not a deficiency of the argument. Pardon. Rather, it is just the fact that you can plug in anything you'd like in any argument, okay? That's not a defeater or deficiency of the argument. The question is, and I've said this in multiple times in multiple contexts, what you plug into the argument, is it actually able to pay the bills on the actual claim? Okay. So that's important to keep in mind. So let's take a look at the attempt to substitute Odin or Thor or any deity from polytheistic systems, for example, right? You take the Greek pantheon or Roman pantheon or whatever. Okay. For the Christian God in the transcendental argument is really going to collapse when you take a closer look, right? Because think about it. These deities fundamentally fail to provide the necessary preconditions for knowledge. And the reason is really twofold. First, the nature of these gods, these polytheistic deities, okay, the nature of these deities lack the requisite ontological and epistemic attributes that make rationality and intelligibility possible. Secondly, polytheistic frameworks necessarily introduce what we can call metaphysical fragmentation, which undercuts the very universality and invariance that knowledge requires. And so to begin, the gods of Norse mythology are contingent beings, right? They're not absolute, they're not necessary, they're not self-existent, okay? They are finite entities within the cosmos rather than the transcendent creator of all things. Odin, for example, and it's hard for me to think of Odin without thinking of Anthony Hopkins from the Marvel movies Thor. But Odin, for example, is depicted as one who seeks wisdom rather than being the ontological ground of wisdom itself, right? Odin gains knowledge through experience and issues of sacrifice and struggle, which is all implicit admissions to epistemic limitation. And so this fundamentally is different from the Christian God, whose knowledge is original. God's knowledge is exhaustive. It's unconditioned. Think about this. A God who is himself a mere participant in the causal order, okay, cannot serve as the foundation for the very intelligibility of that order. All right. So if Odin or Thor were posited as the basis for knowledge, their epistemic status would be arbitrary and contingent, meaning that knowledge itself would be contingent rather than necessary, reducing all truth claims to historical accidents rather than rational necessities. All right. They do not have the ontological and epistemic ingredients to ground what is needed for the possibility of knowledge. Again, the polytheistic framework of Norse mythology, okay, introduces an inherent problem of metaphysical unity. Okay. Knowledge requires universal, invariant laws of logic, mathematics, morality, all these things that transcend particular times and places. But the Norse pantheon consists of multiple deities with competing wills and limited powers, making it incapable of providing a singular, okay, unifying ground for these laws. And so if ultimate reality is divided among multiple gods, then there is no fundamental reason why logical principles must hold universally. Right? Any appeal to the supposed authority of Odin or Thor in sustaining rationality itself is going to be arbitrary, right? As their own limitations and dependence on a larger cosmic order suggest that they too are subject to some higher reality rather than being the absolute source of it. Okay. Again, notice how this is in stark contrast to the Christian conception of the world. I mean, consider the Christian doctrine of divine aseity, right? God has self-existence. He has independence from creation, which ensures the rational structure of the universe is rooted in a necessary being whose nature does not change, right? The nature of God is consistent. Okay. The triune God of Christianity provides the metaphysical unity and diversity required for knowledge, right? The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit share one divine essence while remaining distinct persons, mirroring the unity and plurality found in human reasoning and creation. You contrast this with Norse mythology, it offers no analogous ontological grounding for such a bringing together of unity and diversity. Okay? It merely presents a pantheon of beings whose interactions are governed by a reality external to them. okay, which only pushes the question further back. What ultimately grounds intelligibility? Because as finite gods, they're not going to have the necessary and sufficient ingredients to ground intelligible experience, knowledge, and these kind of universal necessities, okay? Now, ultimately, the problem of theistic personalism in polytheistic religions, I think, further undermines their ability to serve as these, what we call these preconditions for knowledge. Odin and Thor, like the deities of other mythological traditions, are depicted as superhuman, but, these superhuman beings, but really fundamentally personal in the way that humans are, okay? Possessing emotions, limitations, subjection to fate, which is a higher order than they, and they act more like powerful cosmic, administrators than a sovereign, self-sufficient creator. Christianity, however, okay, puts forth God as the very foundation of reality itself, okay, whose personal nature does not undermine, but rather secures the absolute metaphysical structure of reality. And this guarantees that knowledge is not arbitrary, right? It's not subject to the whims of finite gods, but is grounded in a necessary, unchanging divine rationality. And so to attempt to replace Yahweh with Odin or Thor really fails, not arbitrarily, but because these beings lack the necessary characteristics to serve as the foundation for knowledge. They are finite, they're contingent, subject to external reality rather than being its source, and they don't provide an immutable foundation for logic, truth, and epistemic reliability. And so they cannot serve as the transcendental ground for knowledge. Only the triune God of Scripture, self-existent, sovereign, and omniscient, provides the necessary preconditions for rational thought. And so the impossibility of the contrary remains, and all alternatives, Norse mythology included, is going to collapse into skepticism. Now, obviously, there's more to the discussion here. I mean, I understand that atheists will chime in here, right? Because there are many people from different perspectives that think that they can provide these issues, and simply showing that polytheism doesn't work doesn't go far enough, right? I mean, the failure of Norse gods to provide a sufficient precondition for knowledge, they're going to say, cool, I'm not a polytheist, and I don't think polytheism makes sense either, okay? But atheists will come along and say, well, I don't have to appeal to a personal transcendent God for, say, something like logic, okay? And I don't need to appeal to kind of the polytheistic pantheon of, the mythical Norse, pantheon or Greek gods or whatever, okay? Atheists can come along and say, well, I could make sense out of logic just fine, okay? And so many atheists that I've encountered will claim that the laws of logic, for example, okay, this is not a problem for atheism. The laws of logic are merely linguistic constructs that describe the consistency of reality, okay? On this view, logic is not something that exists independently of human minds, but rather it's something we invent to categorize and make sense of the way reality behaves, okay? But again, this position is going to fail for the same reason the appeal to Odin and Thor fail, okay? It's ultimately arbitrary, and it fails to provide a necessary foundation for the possibility or the very rationality that it presupposes. Now, to see this, we need to push the question one step further, okay? If someone were to say that the laws of logic are a linguistic construct that we use to describe the consistency of reality, we push the question back then. Why is reality consistent? Or are we not allowed to ask those questions, right? The why questions are not good questions. No, we're going to push back, right? We're pushing to the foundation of a worldview. Why is reality consistent? You see, the atheist who claims that the laws of logic simply describe the regularities of the world has only provided a surface level response. Describing something is the case is not the same as explaining why it is the case. If logic is merely a human invention that systematizes the apparent consistency of reality, then what then guarantees that reality will remain consistent? Okay, this gets to the issue of the uniformity of nature, which I forgot to mention in our list of preconditions for knowledge. Okay, why does the universe continue to behave in a rational and orderly manner rather than descending into chaos, right? Sound and fury signifying nothing. Why do logical principles such as the law of non-contradiction or the principle of identity apply universally and necessarily, rather than being contingent features of our experience? And again, you'll have some people say they don't necessarily apply universally. So you have to contend with folks who think that they apply universally and they have a justification for it. And so we're going to ask, why is reality consistent in the way that it is? And then you're going to have atheists who say, yeah, they're not universal. Okay, so you're going to have different variety of answers to this question, both of which I think fail. Okay. And so in my estimation, the atheist is without a principled answer. At best, they might appeal to something like a brute fact, right? That reality simply is this way without any deeper explanation. But again, this is nothing more than an arbitrary stopping point. To say that the universe just happens to be rationally ordered without providing a sufficient reason for why, okay, is no different than appealing to mythological gods who are themselves bound by a reality they didn't create. And so it's an ad hoc assumption rather than a necessary precondition for knowledge, okay? You contrast this with the Christian worldview, okay? The Christian worldview provides a non-arbitrary foundation for logic and the uniformity of reality, okay? Because God is self-existent, immutable, and rational. The structure of reality necessarily reflects the consistency of his nature, okay? The laws of logic for the Christian are not merely descriptive conventions, but the necessary expression of God's rational and consistent character, this is key, which is woven into the fabric of creation itself. And this is why we can trust that reality will, not suddenly become chaotic or irrational, because its order is grounded in the immutable, consistent nature of a sovereign and rational creator. Atheism, on the other hand, can only assert that logic and consistency if they don't have some other explanation they can give. But this is just a brute feature of the universe with no explanation for why they hold universally and necessarily. Okay, but an appeal to brute fact, okay, is indistinguishable from an appeal to randomness. It provides no rational basis for trusting that the future will resemble the past, that contradictions cannot suddenly be true, or that our reasoning faculties are reliable. It's ultimately a leap in the dark, whereas Christianity provides a coherent and necessary explanation, okay? And so, once again, the impossibility of the contrary emerges. Whether one appeals to Norse mythology, secular naturalism, or any other non-Christian system, they all fail to justify the very foundations of knowledge they presuppose. The Christian worldview alone provides the necessary precondition for intelligibility, rationality, and epistemic certainty. And so the skeptic may attempt to deny this, but in so doing, they must assume the very rational order that only the Christian God can account for, demonstrating that even in their objections, they unwittingly testify to the truth of the Christian God. Now, I can hear the skeptic saying, well, wait a minute, not so fast, Mr. Christian, okay? You said that we appeal to the consistency of reality as a brute given, okay? But you appeal to brute factuality as well, Mr. Christian, because clearly God is a brute fact. And of course, my response to that is, no, he's not. Okay. Within Christian theism, God is not a brute fact, especially when you understand what a brute fact is, philosophically speaking. Okay. If we're using definitions correctly, a brute fact is a fact without explanation, neither internal or external explanations. Okay. If a fact has an internal or external explanation, then by definition, it is not a brute fact. Okay. So God, it's true that God does not have an external explanation. Given the doctrine of divine aseity, God is self-sufficient and independent. His existence is not dependent upon or contingent upon something external to himself. But God does in fact have an internal explanation. And the internal explanation is that God exists out of the necessity of his own nature. Okay. He is the great I am. Okay, and so by definition, if God has an internal explanation, then by definition, he's not a brute fact. Okay, a brute fact is a contingent fact, and it is a fact without any justification or explanation. It just is, and that's why brute facts, I would argue, are arbitrary. And again, brute facts, as Van Til, I quote Van Til, brute facts are mute facts. So all facts have to be interpreted in light of a worldview, and the whole debate here that this argument presents is whose worldview can make sense out of facts. Okay, so this is really, really important to keep in mind. Okay, so no, Christianity does not appeal ultimately to brute factuality. As a matter of fact, brute factuality is explicitly rejected in presuppositional literature. Okay, so if you say, well, reality is consistent, that's just a brute fact. Well, I mean, you could say that, Okay. But if brute facts are arbitrary, your worldview is grounded on an arbitrary assumption that what do you do when someone challenges that assumption? Okay. What if someone chooses a different brute fact than the brute fact that you've chosen? Okay. How do you dispute between each other? Okay. Or do you have an ultimate grounding? Okay. Or an ultimate justification for why your brute fact is better than someone else's brute fact? These are questions. Right? These are important questions to keep in mind. Now, someone might be listening to what I'm saying. They'll say, well, wait a minute, Eli, you haven't demonstrated the necessity of your God because you have not refuted all other worldviews, all possible worldviews that are out there. Okay. But actually, this point misunderstands the nature of transcendental argumentation. Okay. The claim that we need to refute all other worldviews individually in order to demonstrate the truth of Christianity by the impossibility of the contrary, presupposes a method of verification that is foreign to the kind of argument that we're making. A transcendental argument does not operate like an inductive or evidential argument that requires the exhaustive refutation of every conceivable alternative. Rather, we are dealing with necessary preconditions for intelligibility and knowledge. The nature of necessity itself dictates that there can only be one true necessary foundation. Otherwise, it wouldn't be necessary in the first place. We wouldn't be discussing necessary preconditions. All right? And so to clarify this, a necessary precondition is that which must be true in order for something to be possible. And so if multiple alleged necessary preconditions existed, they would either be redundant, in which case one would be unnecessary, or they would be in conflict, which would render them incapable of grounding absolute universal truths. And so necessity by definition excludes alternatives when we're using this term necessary preconditions. And so if Christianity is the necessary precondition for intelligibility, then all other worldviews are necessarily false, not because we have disproven them one by one, but because their very existence as possible competitors contradicts the very concept of necessity. And this is why the transcendental argumentation is really distinct from probabilistic reasoning, right? We're not saying that Christianity is merely the best explanation among many explanations, as if we're kind of like stacking competing hypotheses against each other, right? Rather, we are arguing that Christianity is the only possible foundation that makes knowledge intelligible at all. Okay? And so if Christianity is that foundation, then it follows that all non-Christian worldviews fail at that fundamental level. They're at best parasitic, right? Borrowing from Christian capital to make sense of the world while denying the foundation that makes sense of it. And so to put it another way, think of like an example. Imagine someone demanding that we disprove every supposed alternative to the law of non-contradiction before affirming its truth. Okay. This, again, would be absurd because the nature of logical absolutes means that any purported denial of them must already assume them in order to be meaningful, right? And so the same is, we're arguing, is true of the Christian worldview in relation to knowledge specifically. If it is the necessary foundation for rationality, then every alternative must by definition collapse into arbitrariness, contradiction, or epistemic skepticism. And so the objection that we must refute every worldview individually, right, is really misplaced and based on a misunderstanding, right? The impossibility of the contrary is not established by an exhaustive catalog of failed worldviews, but by the recognition that apart from the Christian God, the Christian worldview, okay, the metaphysical and epistemological picture it presents, rationality itself is unintelligible. Every attempt to deny this must ultimately, we would argue, presuppose the very intelligibility that Christianity alone can justify. And so in this way, the transcendental argument for the Christian God, or the Christian worldview rather, functions not as a probability-based inference to the best explanation, but as a definitive demonstration that apart from Christianity, knowledge is impossible. Okay? So to summarize, the transcendental argument establishes that only the Christian worldview provides the necessary preconditions for intelligibility, rationality, and knowledge. And this is demonstrated as follows. Point one, knowledge requires an objective foundation. The very act of reasoning presupposes the existence of universal, invariant, and necessary truths, such as the laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, the reliability of human cognitive faculties, all these things that we went through, unity and diversity, so on and so forth. And these cannot be contingent human conventions or arbitrary features of reality. They must have an absolute foundation. Okay? Two, only a self-existent, rational, and immutable foundation can account for these preconditions. The universal and necessary nature of logic and rationality requires an absolute, personal, and rational source. Atheistic naturalism fails because it cannot justify why reality is consistently rational rather than chaotic. Polytheism fails because it introduces a fragmented metaphysical structure that lacks what we said before, a unifying basis for logic and knowledge. All non-Christian worldviews fail because they either undermine rationality or depend on brute facts, which provide no justification for knowledge at all, since brute facts don't provide a justification. Brute facts just are. Okay? Point 3, the Christian God uniquely provides that foundation. Christianity alone posits a self-existent, sovereign, and rational God whose nature is the very source of truth and intelligibility. The laws of logic reflect his immutable and consistent nature. Okay? The uniformity of reality is a function of his providence, and human cognitive faculties are reliable because they were designed by God to function in accordance with reality. And so because these preconditions are necessary, Christianity is true. Since knowledge is possible, a premise that hopefully the skeptic is going to affirm. If you deny it, it's going to be problematic, right? And since only the Christian worldview provides the necessary conditions for knowledge, it follows that the Christian worldview is true. Okay? Any attempt to deny this presupposes the very rational order that Christianity can account for, demonstrating the impossibility of the contrary. And so Christianity, again, is not merely one explanation among many. It's the only possible foundation for rational thought. The impossibility of the contrary ensures that apart from the triune God of Scripture, knowledge itself becomes unintelligible. And therefore, the truth of Christianity is not simply an inference, but a transcendental necessity, without which nothing can be known or rationally justified. Now, we often talk about materialistic atheism. What about atheism of the immaterial sort, right? Atheistic immaterialism, something like Platonism, for example. Right? So the appeal to immaterial atheism, which often, at least as I've seen it, comes in the form of some kind of Platonism, right? Attempts, okay, to avoid the failure of materialistic atheism by putting forth an abstract realm of immaterial necessary truths, such as the laws of logic, mathematical objects, and moral values, kind of this whole issue of abstract objects, right, that exist independently of human minds in the material world, okay? But, okay, I would say that this position also fails. It doesn't escape the core problems that were presented in some of the other views. Again, it lacks necessary explanatory resources to account for the connection between these abstract entities and human knowledge, making it ultimately arbitrary and incapable of grounding rationality. Okay, here are a few points. Number one, I would argue that Platonism lacks an ontological and epistemic connection between mind and body. Mind and body, I'm thinking dualism. Mind and reality, okay? Sorry about that. Platonism asserts that abstract entities, such as logical laws or numbers, exist in some kind of non-physical but non-theistic realm, okay? And so the immediate problem is that, again, as I see it, is that such a realm by definition is causally inert, right? Abstract objects don't cause anything. They don't have any causal powers. Okay, these abstract objects don't do anything. They simply exist. But if they're causally disconnected from the physical world, how do human beings have access to them? How do we as finite minds reliably grasp necessary and universal truths? You see, Christian theism solves this by grounding logic and knowledge in the rational mind of God, who both creates the world according to his rational order and endows human beings with cognitive faculties designed to correspond to that very order. In contrast, you think of Platonism. Platonism assumes that human minds just happen to have some kind of innate access to this abstract realm of truths without any sufficient explanation for how or why. And again, this is pure arbitrariness. If the abstract realm of logical laws and numbers exist independently, why should we expect finite, contingent minds emerging from the physical world to be able to access and correctly apply them? It's a fair question. Okay. My second point, Platonism undermines the necessity of logical and moral laws. Platonism claims that logic and morality are necessary because they exist eternally and independently of the material world. But again, this assertion ultimately is question-begging. The mere claim that these things exist necessarily doesn't explain why they must exist or why they should hold authority over what we call the contingent world, right? In contrast, the Christian worldview provides the necessary explanation. Logic and moral truths exist because they reflect the very character and necessary self-existent God. But if logic, morality, mathematics, or anything along these lines are merely brute realities, right? And not just brute reality, they're brute realities of an impersonal Platonic realm, then there's no explanation for why they should apply universally, right? Why should contingent physical reality conform to the structure of an abstract non-physical realm, right? Platonism doesn't give us an answer. It simply assumes this correspondence, while Christianity, I would argue, justifies it by rooting all truth in the rational, sovereign creator. Okay? Again, Platonism also reduces to epistemic skepticism. Since Platonism lacks a, what do we call it? We call it a causal connection between the immaterial and the physical, right? It has no way to guarantee that human reasoning actually aligns with the realm of abstract truths. And so if knowledge is merely a matter of the human mind mysteriously grasping or participating in the Platonic realm, then it's ungrounded. That's an ungrounded assumption, right? That our thoughts actually correspond to truth. How do we know that we're accessing the correct abstract realities and not mere subjective approximations? You see, without divine revelation and a God who's intentionally structured our cognitive faculties to align with reality, again, Platonism is going to leave us in skepticism, okay? And then ultimately, it leads us into arbitrariness, right? Again, Platonism is putting forth this idea of an eternal, necessary realm of abstract truths without any reason for why such realm exists. This is, again, philosophically unsatisfying. I think it's unsatisfying, and I think it's arbitrary, okay? The Christian worldview provides a principled foundation, okay? You might not like the foundation, you might not like the idea of God, but here's the foundation. God is the necessary being whose nature itself, the consistency of who he is, grounds logic, morality, and the structure of reality itself. His existence is not arbitrary, but is the only sufficient explanation for why universal, immaterial, invariant truths exist at all. Okay? And so while Platonism seeks to avoid the pitfalls of materialism, right, by acknowledging the existence of immaterial, universal truths, it ultimately fails to justify why those truths apply to our world, why we can know them, and why they hold necessary authority, okay? It merely assumes these things without a justification, which again reduces it to an arbitrary stopping point. And so Christianity provides the necessary foundation for knowledge, okay? God is personal, rational, he's sovereign, he's the sovereign creator who structured reality according to his own nature, making knowledge both possible and intelligible. And so even immaterial atheism in the form of Platonism ultimately fails. The impossibility of the contrary remains, and Christianity alone provides the necessary preconditions for intelligibility, logic, and knowledge. Okay? And so to summarize, we can see that the transcendental argument, I think, is firmly established. If knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true. Knowledge is possible, therefore, the Christian worldview is true. And so at every turn, competing worldviews collapse under their own weight. So polytheism, including Norse mythology, to use that example, fails because its gods are finite, contingent beings that don't ground universal. They can't ground universal and necessary truths. Materialistic atheism fails because it cannot account for the immaterial and invariant laws of logic, nor can it justify the uniformity of nature or the reliability of human cognition. Platonism, though acknowledging immaterial truths, which I think is a plus, right? Okay, fails ultimately to explain their applicability, their connection to human minds, or why they should govern reality at all. Each alternative is ultimately arbitrary, unable to justify the very rationality that it assumes. Okay? Only Christian theism provides the necessary foundation for knowledge. The laws of logic are not floating abstractions or human conventions on Christian worldview. They are reflections of the rational nature of the self-existent, immutable, and consistent triune God, who's revealed himself both in general and special revelation. The uniformity of reality is, on the Christian conception, not a brute fact. It is upheld by his sovereign providence. The reliability of human cognition is not an accident of evolution or a mysterious link to an abstract realm. It is the product of divine design, as we are made in God's image. Okay, and we're able to apprehend that reality because God reveals it. He's created our cognitive faculties to be able to have access to those things. Okay, and so because these are necessary preconditions for knowledge, and because necessity excludes alternatives, Christianity is not merely the best explanation. I've argued it is the only explanation. The impossibility of the contrary confirms the truth of the Christian worldview, and any attempt to deny it must assume rationality, logic, and intelligibility, concepts that can only be justified if Christianity is true. And so the transcendental argument succeeds, I think. Without the triune God of Scripture, knowledge itself would be impossible. But since knowledge is possible, then the Christian worldview is true. Okay? Now, a couple of distinctions to be made. A common philosophical objection to transcendental arguments is that even if they're successful, okay, they only establish that a certain concept is necessary for thought rather than kind of necessary for reality. Okay, and this is that the argument merely shows that we must presuppose the Christian worldview in order to engage in rational thought, but it doesn't prove that Christianity is actually true in an ontological sense. Okay. And so the critic claims that while the Christian worldview may be an indispensable conceptual framework for reasoning, this doesn't entail that it actually corresponds to reality, just as certain mathematical axioms might be necessary for calculations, but doesn't necessarily reflect an objective metaphysical structure of the universe. Okay. And of course, this is something when someone points this out, I mean, it's a great observation, by the way, and it is a typical criticism of transcendental arguments. But this objection, I think, fundamentally misunderstands the nature of this particular flavor of transcendental argumentation. When we argue that Christianity is the necessary precondition for knowledge, we're not merely making a claim about what we must think in order to reason, but about what must actually be the case for rational thought to be possible at all. And this is precisely what sets this transcendental argument, or at least Van Til's argumentation, I would argue, what sets it apart from those more like pragmatic or epistemic methodologies and forms of argumentation. The transcendental arguments that I'm arguing for is not just dealing with conceptual realities, okay? If knowledge exists, then reality, we would argue, must be structured in such a way that knowledge is possible. And so the objection assumes that one can meaningfully separate what is necessary for thought from what is necessary for reality. But this is precisely what the transcendental argument challenges, right? The question is not merely what we must think, but what must be true of the world in order for our thinking to have any meaning or intelligibility at all. And so to illustrate this, imagine a skeptic who argues that causality is merely a necessary conceptual framework for human thought, but doesn't reflect an actual structure in reality. This, again, would be incoherent because the very act of reasoning itself presupposes causal relationships, right? You have logical entailments, inferences, explanations, so on and so forth. In the same way, logical laws are not just conceptual necessities, but reflect the fundamental structure of reality itself. Otherwise, they wouldn't be universally applicable beyond our own minds, okay? And so if a worldview only provided a conceptual necessity without ontological grounding, then, of course, then this criticism would be appropriate. But Christianity uniquely avoids this pitfall because it identifies the necessary precondition of rational thought with the necessary precondition of reality itself, namely the triune God and his revelation. And so the laws of logic are not arbitrary human constructs or floating abstractions, as Platonism would suggest. They're grounded in the immutable, consistent rationality of God himself. The uniformity of nature, again, is not a mere assumption for human thought. It is a feature of the created order, upheld by divine providence. If knowledge exists, the necessary foundation must exist ontologically, not merely conceptually. And so the objection, I think, collapses. There's no meaningful distinction between conceptual necessity and ontological necessity when dealing with the necessary transcendental conditions. And so if Christianity were only conceptually necessary, then yeah, that's fine. But since knowledge and intelligibility are actual features of reality, the necessary preconditions for those features must be real as well. And so the Christian worldview is not only necessary for thought, I would agree with that, but it is necessary for reality itself. Okay. Now, I do know the distinction. There is, of course, a distinction between conceptual transcendental arguments and ontological transcendental arguments. The line of reasoning that I present here falls squarely within providing the conceptual necessity and the ontological necessity, right? It's not merely aiming. I'm not merely aiming to establish that Christianity is necessary as a conceptual scheme for human thought, but rather that it is necessary, ontologically speaking, it's ontological foundation for reality itself, the Christian worldview. And so this is not merely a transcendental argument about presuppositions of human cognition, but about the preconditions for there to be an intelligible reality at all. And this distinction is really important when you consider the kinds of critiques raised by someone like Barry Stroud or someone along those lines. I'm very familiar with that line of reasoning. But the issue is the critiques that are put forth by Barry Stroud and others along his lines aren't addressing the specific claims of the presuppositionalist who is utilizing the transcendental argument, right? It is unique. And to my knowledge, I don't even think that Barry Stroud was even specifically addressing something like what Van Til was doing or Bonson or other analytic philosophers in the presuppositional tradition are doing, all right? So if knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true. Knowledge is possible, therefore the Christian worldview is true. I've tried to provide a justification for the first premise. Obviously, not everyone's going to agree. But that's where interaction takes place. That's where meaningful and fruitful discussion is had. And that's the nature of, interaction and disagreement and things like that. But I hope that this is at least helpful in terms of outlining the reasoning behind my argument and for how I would argue for the necessity of the Christian worldview, its ontological and metaphysical picture, its epistemological features, provides or satisfies or provides a justification for the preconditions for the very possibility of knowledge. All right. Well, that is a lot. I am only human, so I cannot go for hours and hours. Some people can go on for like 2 or 3 hours. That's really hard for me. I start losing my voice because when I'm not doing this, I'm also a full-time teacher, so I have to talk all the time. And then I'm a traveling speaker as well. So before I completely and utterly lose my voice, I hope that this was interesting and useful for folks. And until next time, guys, take care and God bless. Bye-bye.